Well, let's turn our Bible to the book of Job. Book of Job tonight will be the first week that we launch out into a study of this book. It'll continue over the next few weeks. Not sure exactly how long it's going to take as we look into it. But it's certainly an interesting book. It's the book is said to be one of the great literary treasures of the world. It's a book that's been studied not only by believers, but by unbelievers alike. And it has great wisdom and insight for both groups. And we want to begin to look into it. And tonight we want to look into it. As we begin to look into it, we're going to think about maybe just an introduction and talk a little bit about what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks, how we're going to go about approaching this book. We're not necessarily going to be going verse by verse. So what it's going to require from us is that we begin to read forward. In other words, at the end of the night, if I fail to remind you or request of you to read chapters 1 and 2, let me say it now, because I may just forget to do that. We'll want to read chapters 1 and 2 for next week when we begin to look in a little bit more deeply, a little more closely as to what's being said to us through this amazing book. So it's one of the great literary treasures of the world, but it's one of the more profound books in the Bible. Bible scholars will certainly mention that just based upon the content, what it has to say, the issues that it deals with. And it's one being a profound, or one of the more profound books in the Bible, is a statement that reflects the fact that the subject of this book has intrigued the minds of humanity ever since the fall. People have been looking into what is being said in relation to real life experiences for them. Not only for them, perhaps maybe not only them, but for their family, friends, their loved ones. So when we think about the book, what would we say perhaps would be a primary subject of the book? What would be an overarching theme? And I think we could summarize it down to simply this. If we were to say what is the main subject, we could say, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things seem to happen to good people? All of us are familiar somewhat with the book of Job, and we know Job's story is one that is pretty challenging when you get into the details of all that has taken place in his life. He's a man who certainly would be considered good. As a matter of fact, God is the one who comes out in the first chapter in verse 1 and basically says that Job is a good man. Isn't that what it says in chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of Job? Let me just read that to us here real quick. In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and he shunned evil. So what does it mean when the Lord says he is blameless and upright? Blameless would most likely refer to his character, to what he believed, who he was. And his if character is in reference to blameless, by the word upright would probably be in reference to his daily actions, the way that he lived out what he believed. So when we think about, why do bad things happen to good people, right away here we know from the Lord himself that Job is a good man, but yet we're not going to get much further into chapter 1 and especially into chapter 2. We're going to find out that some very terrible things come to him by way of tragedy to his family and all of his possessions. And we see, and we'll look at that a little closer, like I said, into next week. So not only does the Lord say that Job is a good man, but there's something else that I want you to know in verse 12 of chapter 1, and that is who is responsible or who allows Job to experience the difficulties and the unfortunate circumstances of his life. What does it say in verse 12? Look at it. The Lord said to say, very well then, everything he has is in your hands. But on the man himself do not lay a finger. So who does it sound like is given permission for difficulty, hardship, struggle, trial to come to Job's life. Satan is the one who is going to be responsible for working it out, but who allows it to happen? It's the Lord. It's the Lord who allows this to happen. So that invites the question, what about, is God just in the way that He goes about carrying out, supervising, watching over, being sovereign over all of His creation? Are His policies right? The way that humanity, the way that His creation works its way out, are His dealings with humanity fair and just? So these are some of the questions that begin to be asked when we think about what's going on in the book of Job. But there's still another subject that we need to think about. And the second one is, where does wisdom come from? That's the second big question that's dealt with in the book of Job. And it comes from chapter 28. In chapter 28, verse 12, Job asked the question. Let me turn over and let's read 3 verses in chapter 28 of the book of Job, in light of the fact that the second big theme would be wisdom, and where does wisdom come from? And as we get into the dialogues and the discussions and the debate that goes on between Job's 3 friends and himself, we'll find out that wisdom has a lot to do with their understanding of why he is going through the circumstances that he is facing. In chapter 28, verse 12, Job asks the question, or it's accredited to Job, or the author of the book, where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? Then look at verse 20. Where does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? And then, of course, the answer that we understand, we know, is in verse 28. And in verse 28, and he said to the man, fear the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil. Well, that just happens to be Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7 as well. Fear the Lord and shun evil. And there is where understanding, wisdom and understanding will be found. So, the 2 primary themes. One is going to be, why do bad things seem to happen to good people? And the other theme that we're going to be addressing has to do with the subject of wisdom and how it relates. Where do we look for wisdom? How do we find wisdom? Is wisdom a creation of man, or is wisdom found in the Lord also? So what I want us to do before we start reading any further, we do want to read the first few verses of the book of Job. We get together any time when we think about studying the Word of God. We want to read from the Word of God more than just a handful of verses. And we want to look into that. But before we do, I think it's helpful for us, especially as we begin to look into a new book. We spent several weeks in the book of Acts. Now we're going to spend a few weeks in the book of Job. But it's helpful for us to have somewhat of an overview, or think about, again, the bigger themes, the bigger subjects of what's going on in any book of the Bible, especially one as long and one that is as challenging as the book of Job has been throughout the years, as great scholarly minds have come to this and tried to ascertain its full value in teaching. So a good commentary or a good study Bible. Hopefully some of you here tonight maybe have a study Bible. Study Bible is a Bible that just has footnotes and helps in it. That's a very good resource, a very good tool, because you'll notice if you have a study Bible, most of them, at the beginning of each book, they have a section that is set aside to give you an overview of various aspects and elements of the book that you're about to get into. So a commentary does the same thing, and a good study Bible. Both of them are going to, or would definitely prove to be very helpful or very beneficial to us. And the reason is they provide a wealth of information related to everything that we will that we'll be looking into. So what are some of the things that they provide? In your study Bible or in your commentary, one of the first things that they'll probably reference is who is the author. Well, you'll find out very quickly in your study Bible or a commentary, and when it comes to the book of Job, the author is anonymous. No one really knows. who the author is. So scholars will not come to a sure and certain or concrete position as to who the author is, nor does the book say who the author is. It's anonymous. A commentary or a study Bible will also talk about the date. And again, on the date, there's not a consensus. Perhaps the only consensus among scholars is that they're not sure. They're not sure what the date is. It could be as far as 1,000 years before the time of Moses, all the way up to the intertestament period, the 400 years from the close of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament. In that time frame, and different people, based upon some information that's related in the book itself, and some people, some historical sites and things, and groups of people that are mentioned, try to narrow it down to different times in, from before Moses to the end of the Old Testament. But when you come to the end of the conversation, I think most, from what I've seen and what I've studied, is most say they're just not sure. Just not sure when it was written. So even though we don't know the author, and we don't know when it was written, does that mean that it has no value for us? Not at all. It just means that we need to keep that in perspective whenever we look into it. Who would you say, if you were asked who is the author of the book of Job, who would you say? Oh, in a big sense. I would say the Lord is the author. He is the one responsible. We know from Paul's writings, Peter's writings, that, it is the work of the Spirit who moved in the heart and mind of men in order to lead them to right. And, certainly we have the feeling that, it's an Old Testament book, but Job is not an Israelite. He's a man from the land of Uz. Can God work through people who are not Hebrews, are not Israelites? He certainly can. He worked through another man who's pretty prominent in the Hebrew faith, and that is a man by the name of Abraham. He worked through his children as well. So I think the angel who shared with Mary one night that nothing is impossible with God is a good point of reference for us to think about when it comes to not being sure about who the author is, not being sure at what time it was written. But God has provided it. It's been recognized to be a part of the canon, or the 66 books of the Bible. So we can trust what it is or what it has to say, because that's what's important, what it has to say. So when we think about commentaries and study Bibles, they talk about the overall purpose or the overall themes, or some of the themes that you'll be looking at as you read through that. And a book like Job would certainly be one that you would want to begin to get some of these themes and ideas in your mind as you begin to read through the book, because it does have 42 chapters. And so there's a lot of text in the book of Job. Theological themes, theological lessons, commentaries, and study Bibles help point out some of these and help make application from what's being taught, especially when the book of Job being a book considered in the wisdom category, wisdom literature. Wisdom literature oftentimes is dialogues, monologues, essays that deal with, the meaning of life, that deal with the mysteries of life. And is there any bigger mystery person that we could say related to life than why does bad things happen to good people? Why is there suffering in the world, especially in light of the fact that we have a sovereign God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, who watches over, who guides us, and who guides his people in creation? So these are some of the questions that are there. That's something that we want to think about as far as themes and lessons. So what I wanted to share with you tonight, I have a little book that's very helpful, and it's not necessarily a commentary, and it's not a study Bible. But it is a book that would be very helpful, not only for the book of Job, but for any book that you read, and it's written by Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart. And it's called How to Read the Bible, Book by Book. And what it does is it takes a book and it begins to work through these particular ideas as far as the author, the date, the purpose of the book, the themes, theological themes. It begins to work through things like that and to give us some advice as to how to read the book of Job, or if we were studying the book of Isaiah, how to read the book of Isaiah, or if we went into the New Testament, what should we be thinking about as we begin to read one of the Gospels? Some of those things to lay down a framework for us to think about. So I want to talk about a little bit about that, and at the same time, what I'll do is share with you how I hope to begin to work through the book of Job in just a few weeks here over the next few weeks that we're together. So, the overview of Job, from how to read the book, or how to read the Bible book by book. The first thing they talk about here, and I'll share a lot of what Fee and Stuart have written here. The first thing we want to think about is some central issues. And we touched on those just a minute ago, but we want to think about them again as we begin to think about the book a little closer. They primarily say that we are to focus on two. Number one would be the ways of God related to suffering. The ways of God related to suffering. What does God think about the suffering that is prevalent in His creation? How does God respond to that? How does God respond to those who cry out to Him for answers? Which, by the way, is what Job is going to do. He's going to be asking of the Lord, what is going on in my life? And the second thing is, where is true wisdom found? We talked about that from the 28th chapter just a few moments ago. So how does the book of Job break down? And I can give you this little diagram afterwards if you fall behind and not able to write it all down. What we're going to look at next week is how many chapters? 2. Chapters 1 and 2. It's narrative. It's called the prologue. It's the introduction. So we're going to look at that, and it's going to give us some insight as to what is happening in the life of Job. And it's going to one of the things that's going to be amazing about what we're going to see from chapters 1 and 2 in the book of Job is God knows what's going on. The Satan knows what's going on, but who doesn't necessarily know what's going on? Job. He doesn't know what's going on. And there's not any place in the book where Job is ever told that basically he is being used as a test. And so we'll talk about that next week, that the Lord is allowing him to be used. And so that could prompt some questions in our mind too, as to, is God just in the way that He deals with His creation? But we'll look into some of those. So chapters 1 and 2 are the prologue. Chapter 3, when you read through that, you're going to find out that Job is lamenting his situation, his circumstance. Basically what he's doing is cursing the day he was born. So Job laments in chapter 3. And then chapters 4 through 27, what we're going to see is the dialogues and the disputes that Job has with his friends. His 3 friends come to see him. His 3 friends come to comfort him. But yet what we're going to find out, by the time we get to chapter 27, Job says to his friends that they are worthless comforters. And but what we're going to talk about is the role that each person plays. What is the role of, who is it, Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar? What role do they play in the book, in the meaning of life and the mysteries that go along with life? What role do they play? And then what role does Job play? Well, Job's the central actor in the book. He's the one that experiences the hardship and pain. He's the one that has the true questions. And then we run into a guy, chapter 28 is a discourse on wisdom. We talked about that. It's credited to either the author or the narrator or the author, whoever that is. Or maybe if Job is the author, some believe Job is the author himself. And after we get to 29 through 41, we're going to run into 3 monologues. One is Job, And the other one is a young man by the name of Elihu. Now, Elihu is, he's a youth. And you may be surprised to learn that he's got it all figured out. Does that sound familiar to anyone today? And what has he got figured out? He's got figured out he has the wisdom of God. And so we're going to run into him. We're going to run into Job. And then finally, God is going to speak. And it's interesting, you all read the book of Job. You know, Job just at one point is in his monologue, he's just saying, if I had the opportunity to talk to God face to face, if I had the opportunity to defend myself before the God of all creation. Well, I think he's surprised when we get close to the end there that God speaks to him out of the whirlwind, and Job has little to say. But he does come to a place of understanding and repentance. And basically he says, my eyes have seen God. Now, in reference to his eyes seeing God, I think what he's talking about is that he has seen the Lord spiritually. He understands now. So it's and then chapter 42, what do we see? It's the epilogue, it's the ending of the book. God speaks again, and what does God do? He restores Job. Basically, he ends up where he started, and losing the word that I'm searching for right now. I'll come back to it here in just a minute. But he restores him with more than what he had in the beginning. So Job is a man of integrity. And his friends were not right in what they understood as his problem. All three of his friends thought the same thing. Does anyone remember what his friends thought? Basically, the prevailing wisdom of their day, and still somewhat today,
is being punished for sin that he committed.
He was being punished for sin. Many believe the biblical principle is as simple as this. God prospers the righteous and punishes the wicked. They come from that perspective. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute as well. So just some advice for reading Job. This is what they share with us. Some things that we need to think about. Crucial for reading the book of Job is to understand what the author is ultimately about. What is he trying to do? Why is the author? How he has structured the book. We just talked about chapters 1 and 2, then 3, 4 through 27, 28, 29 through 41, and then 42. Why did he structure it this way? Why is it prose, or why is it common language in chapters 1 and 2, and then common language in the epilogue, which would be 41 and 42? Everything in the middle is poetry, pretty much, perhaps except with the exception maybe of chapter 28. So why does he change the genre of writing? And why is it that when you have three friends and you have three discussions, and all of them go from longer to shorter, and Job responds to all three of them with a long response, a shorter response, and a shorter response. And then the same thing kind of happens in the monologues in the second half. The person who is writing is very gifted, he's very talented, and he's being moved, I believe, by God to speak not only to the original reader, but to speak to you and me today as well. So it's a book that's going to be worth studying. And it's a book that hopefully, as we work our way through it, we will have some questions also. And the question about why does bad things happen to good people, many say it's never really answered. It's never really answered in the way that we want it answered. We want it answered in chapter 42, verse 14. By the way, this is why this happened. But Job is going to come to a place where, regardless of what happens to him, he is going to trust, because he knows his Redeemer lives. He is going to trust him regardless. He is not going to sin against his Lord. Although he does He does call the Lord out for being the one responsible. The Lord doesn't hold that against him. So what is he trying to do? Through both his arrangement of things and the content of various speeches, his concern lies again at the 2 points. It's the challenge to God by Satan. In chapter 1, verse 9. Let's go back real quickly. And let's read Job chapter, let's just read the first few verses and we'll pick this up. The challenge, Satan is going to challenge God. What is he talking about here? Let me read this to us. In the land of Uz there lived a man by the name of Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and he shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys. And he had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turns holding feast in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering. For each one of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God. Perhaps. There's no evidence. There's no accusation. It's just perhaps. That in the midst of their celebration, that inadvertently or maybe just within their heart, perhaps maybe they had taken credit for the blessing that they had as opposed to giving that credit to God. In some way. So, here's a man, not only is he a man who is blameless and upright, he certainly has the welfare of his children on his mind as well, their spiritual well-being. Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom, and then that's where we pick up. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came. And notice Satan, where have you come from? Satan answered in, verse 7, where have you come from? And Satan answered the Lord, from roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it. Nowhere in particular, is that what we're saying? Nowhere in particular. Verse 8, then the Lord said to Satan, interesting, the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Well, that's the second time the Lord said that about his servant Job. And then what happens? Verse 9. Does Job fear God for nothing? So what he's saying here is, Dr. Fee and Stewart said, the question is, will a person fear God for nothing? Will a person worship and serve God for free? Because when you look at the life of the children of Job, it appears, or the question could be, perhaps they're serving you, or where Satan's coming from. They're serving you because of what you give them. If they didn't have that, they would curse your faith, or curse you to your face. If they didn't have all the blessings, is what he's saying. So it's a question, it's a challenge. And so what does the Lord say? I go a little further on, we say, well, he gives him the authority to take everything from them. Will he serve him for nothing? And then the other thing we talked about was the wisdom question as well. So what we're going to see, the way we're going to work this out is we're going to look at the role that each person plays. And this is the way they've outlined this, and it seems to be a very good way to approach this. Let's think about the different ones. Satan plays a crucial role in putting God on trial. He's the one that challenges the Lord's policies, the way that the Lord deals with his creation. If they didn't have anything, would they still worship you is kind of the point that he's making. As it was, he's putting God on trial about the basic relationship between God and humanity. Whether their reciprocal joy in each other is only the result of what human creatures get out of it. And then what role does Job's wife play? We see her in chapter 2, verse 9. She plays the role of Satan on earth. She is an adversary to Job, right? What does she ask Job to do? Would you just curse God and die? You know, just leave. So then we think about Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and we think about, what role do they play? Well, they play the role of conventional wisdom. They're going to come at Job with the conventional thinking of their day, and that is, God does what? God prospers the righteous, and He punishes the wicked. So if Job finds himself in a difficult situation, Jeff was right. There must be some unconfessed sin. And Elihu plays the role, as we were talking about earlier, he plays the role of an overconfident youth who thinks that he's really wiser than his elders. And it's interesting when we get over into that, you'll see that Elihu, he grows weary of the other three because they can't coax a confession or a repentant attitude out of Job. So he moves in, and he is going to approach them with the wisdom of his years. What role does Job play? Job plays the central role, of course. He's the one that's caught up in the frustrating enigma. Everything's happening to him, and he wants to know what's going on as a result of that. And then, of course, God, He plays the ultimate role as the initiator of the story. He is thus in charge from the beginning, including getting Satan to think about Job, not the other way around. In the end, the tables are completely turned. The question of where wisdom is found is answered not only in terms of God alone, but also by silencing all the human voices. None of the friends are alive who has an answer that's satisfactory to Job. And second, the question of whether one will serve God without receiving benefits is answered with a resounding yes. The crucial role Job will play in the story. He will serve the Lord without the benefits. And it goes on to say the brilliance of the book lies in the fact that altogether it looks at as though what appears to be a theodicy, and that would be human beings putting God on trial, insisting on explanations for His actions, turns out in fact to be a theology. God putting human beings on trial as to whether they will trust Him, not only when they receive no immediate benefits, but also when He does not give them explanations for what they demand, and thus as to whether they will live within the bounds of creaturely wisdom. And that is the wisdom that God supplies to us. Will we live within the bounds of that, or will we always want to be equal to God and pursue a higher wisdom? And that wisdom takes us away from trusting the Lord and begins to place all the trust within ourselves, which is similar to the temptation that was put before Adam and Eve. Did God really say? What was the temptation? The only reason He doesn't want you to eat from that is because He knows you will become like Him. A greater wisdom, a greater understanding as well. So God's wisdom is evidenced in the created order, in both visible, as it is visible to the eye, and yet beyond human understanding. And He does not give explanation. Then Job, as a result, Job will prove to trust God and His wisdom in the matter of His suffering as well, to which Job offers the ultimate response of humility, and he does that by repenting. So this is what we're going to pick up. As we think about some of these things, we'll mention them over and over again as we begin to work our way through and thinking about what the book of Job has to say to us today.